Hello and welcome to Dog Day Chess. In this episode, we're going to look at threefold repetition. There's a rule in chess that states that if the same position is repeated 3 times in a game, then either player can claim a draw. It's not an automatic draw, but either player has the right to claim it. And this rule is useful to know, especially if you're falling behind and you're looking for a way to draw the game. In this example, we see that white has fallen behind, but white has a way to draw the game by threefold repetition. Because from this position, white can perpetually check the black king until the position is repeated 3 times. Here we see that the white rook is on the h file and the black king is on the g file. So the white rook can move over and check, black king moves to the corner, white rook moves back to check, black king moves back to the g file. This is the second time that this position has occurred. And if white repeats the maneuver one more time, here we have threefold repetition. This position has occurred 3 times, and white can claim a draw. Perpetual check is a special case of threefold repetition. It's a way that one side can force the repetition, but the repetition doesn't have to be forced by perpetual check in order for the rule to apply. It applies regardless of the way the position was repeated. Another thing to note is that the repetition doesn't have to be sequential. If for some reason, after the second repetition, let's say, white decided to move the bishop around and the black knights got moved around and then they finally ended up back on these same squares, then after one more repetition of the check, the position will have been repeated 3 times and the rule will apply. We'll see an example of a non-sequential repetition in a minute. But first I should mention a couple of subtle points about this rule. In order for a position to be considered the same, not only do the pieces have to be on the same squares, but the players must have the same set of allowed moves each time, and this includes the right to do an en passant capture and the right to castle. So in our example, if it were black's turn to move, and black decided to play b5, which would be a mistake, black with the move should take the opportunity to avoid the perpetual check, perhaps by moving the black rook out. But after b5 is played, we see that white has the right to do an en passant capture with the c-pawn. So if white proceeds to check the king, and after one iteration here, even though the pieces are all in the same squares, the allowed moves that each player has are not the same. At this point, white no longer has the right to do an en passant capture. So this is not considered to be the same position as the previous one. Of course, white can continue with the perpetual check, and eventually they will repeat the position 3 times. It won't happen here with the rook on the h file and the king on the g file as happened before, but rather one move later, when we get to this position has been repeated properly 3 times. And only now can a draw be claimed. Another subtlety is that the positions are considered the same if the same type of piece is on a given square. It doesn't necessarily have to be the same piece. So if we back up one move, and if for some reason before repeating the position the 3rd time, some other moves are made in which these 2 knights are swapped, for example, if they should walk around for whatever reason, then when the white rook moves over for the 3rd time, this position is considered to have been repeated 3 times. Even though this knight was initially on this square and this knight was initially on this square, the same types of pieces were on those squares. 2 black knights were occupying a2 and c3, and therefore that qualifies as a repetition. And no, I don't have any examples of this from any of my games, but let's look at some examples that I do have. In this game I'm playing white, and as you can see, black has a slight material advantage, 4 pawns against 3, but white has this advanced passed pawn, which is 2 moves away from promoting with check. So what black wants to do is bring his rook over to the f file so it can combine with his king to attack this passed pawn. And if he's able to do that, he'll surely win the game with these 2 connected passed pawns on the b and c file. But if he's not able to do that, then this advanced pawn will likely promote with check, and white will probably win the game. So this is really a battle over the f file. So what happens is that the black rook checks my king, but my king needs to defend the f file so that the black rook can't come to it. So I move my king down. And this position with my king on f1 and the black rook on c2 will be repeated 3 times. So let's follow it through. The rook comes and checks again. I move my king over to e2 this time. Rook checks again. Back to f1. This is the second repetition of that position. Rook checks again. Move my king up to f2. Rook checks again. And back down to f1. This is the third repetition of this position, and so this game was drawn. I could have broken my repetition by moving my king out away from defending the f-file, and black could have broken the repetition as well, but this was a case of whoever breaks the repetition will end up losing the game. So neither of us did, and the game ended up being drawn. And you'll notice that in this example, the repetition was not sequential. My king did move to a couple of different squares before moving back to the f1 square for the repeated position. Let's look at one last example. In this game, I'm playing black, and I am well down in material, so I'm trying my best to play for a draw. So we arrived at this position, and now I'm threatening to repeat this position 3 times by perpetual check. Because what I can do is I can move my queen to e1 check, king must move to h2, move my queen back to h4 check, king must move to g2. This is the second repetition of this position. And I try to execute it one more time and bring my queen back, but instead of completing the third repetition by moving the white king to g2, white sacrifices the exchange to break the repetition. He brings the rook to block the check, and although I can win the rook for the bishop, it prevents the perpetual check. This sacrifice is certainly justified for white. White can afford to lose a little bit of material in order to prevent the draw because of how strong his position is. So that's what threefold repetition is all about. As always, I hope you learned something from this episode, and thanks for watching.